Right. Hello, my lovely psychology students. Thanks for joining me for another session in attachment. Today we're looking at the AO1 of the Behaviourist Explanations of Attachment, and we're going to be looking at using classical and operant conditioning. That's why it's so important that you know your approaches. Just like we did in psychopathology, we use classical and operant conditioning to explain the development and the maintenance of phobias. We're going to do the same thing in the sense we're going to use our knowledge of classical and operant conditioning to explain that of the formation of attachment. But first of all, let's do a quick recap. According to the behaviourist approach, all behaviour is, and I'm sure I can hear you shout it out, yes, all behaviour is learned. That's it. We need a stimulus and we learn how to respond to it. So remember, it's all about having a stimulus and we learn the response. So stimulus response. What does the term conditioning means? Conditioning means, come on, I'm sure you can tell me. Yes, conditioning means it's the process of learning. It's how we learn to behave to a certain stimulus. Now, what are the two key theories that we can use to explain how we learn? Yes, that's it, you've got it. Operant and classical conditioning. Now, operant and classical conditioning, we'll look at operant here, is a type of learning that takes place because the actions, so how we behave, and the rewards or the punishments of how we behave. So here we're looking about reinforcement, how our behavior is reinforced. Remember, we're more likely to carry out a behavior again if we get a reward, and less likely to carry out a behavior again if we receive a punishment. So it's about the reinforcement and the consequences of our actions. Looking at classical conditioning, it's learning through association. It's taking a neutral stimulus where we have not learned to respond to, and we pair it with an unconditioned stimulus, which elicits an unconditioned response. And then over time, through the conditioning process, the neutral stimulus will hopefully become a conditioned stimulus, which will generate the desired conditioned response that we have associated it with. So we're going to take these two theories to explain the formation of attachment. So we'll start with operant conditioning. Now, according to operant conditioning, we're going to learn through the process of reinforcement. Now, attachment needs to be learned. So we need to learn how to form an attachment. So according to the behaviourist approach or learning theories, attachment is not innate. So we're not born with this drive to form an attachment. We need to learn to form an attachment. And this learning takes through the place through what stimulus? Does anyone have a know? Can you think? The stimulus that we learn to form an attachment is actually, you've got it, food. So food is the motivating stimulus that can then account for how we learn to form an attachment. So let's have a look at operant conditioning. Yeah, there we go. A baby's crying because it's hunger. It's causing it discomfort. So the baby performs the action of crying. And that crying brings food. And so that baby receives the reward of food and it relieves the hunger. So that reward reinforces the action, so the baby will repeat it. So when it gets that discomfort, it cries, and it's learning that that cry will bring food, which will alleviate the hunger. Oh, it feels so much better and happy. So it's about the reward, but it's not just that straightforward. You think, well, how does attachment come in here? It's because who brings the food? So food can be seen as the primary reinforcer because that's the stimulus that gets rid of that feeling of discomfort and hunger. but who brings the food? In this case, we'll say mother as our caregiver. So every time the baby gets fed, the mother brings the food. So the mother is seen as a secondary reinforcer. And every time the baby cries, because it's hungry, it gets food. So the food's a primary reinforcer. It makes it feel better, but it's the mother that brings the food, right? So the mother is then slowly started to be seen as a reward as well because of the food. Till eventually, over a period of time, the mother, when the baby cries, can come on her own without food, and the infant will find pleasure, comfort. And that's what we can call the start of attachment. Because the child, through seeing the mum also as a reward like food, brings pleasure and comfort. And that's the formation of attachment. So a little task for you here. So I'd like you in a moment to pause the video. Come on, I really do want you to pause the video. Pause the video. Fill in the missing words, because this will give us a nice AO1 description of understanding operant conditioning as an explanation to explain how attachment can be formed from the infant's perspective. So let's pause the video now. Come on, I know you want to pause. So pause the video now. Right, great stuff. Thank you for pausing the video and filling in the missing words. So let's see how you did. According to learning theory, the baby has to learn to form an attachment with his mother. It's not innate, doesn't come naturally. They have to learn how to form this attachment. In the process of operant conditioning, the mother rewards the infant by feeding him or her, so that the infant associates the mother with the reward and repeats any action that brings her close. So let's take that a little bit further. This happens because food brings a feeling of pleasure, the reward, to the baby. Food is the primary reinforcer. By removing the discomfort of the hunger, it reinforces the behavior that led to its arrival. So the child, every time it gets that unpleasant feeling of hunger, the food comes along because they've cried. Because remember, it's about their actions, how it gets rewards or punished. So they cry, they get food. Ooh, nice. But food never comes without the mother bringing it. So the mother becomes a secondary reinforcer. Even without bringing food, the presence of the caregiver reduces the discomfort and brings a feeling of pleasure. The baby will therefore repeat any action, for example, crying, to bring the caregiver close. And that is the start of the formation of attachment from an infant's perspective. Because remember, operant conditioning says it's the consequences of your actions, whether they get rewarded. In this case, the baby cries because it's hungry. It sees food as the reward. But food doesn't come on its own. It comes with the mother. So over time, because they're getting the food as a reward, they then see the mother as a reward, even though she was a secondary reinforcer. So over time, each time the mum brings it, gets rewarded, baby feels happy, but also then the child starts to see the mother as a reward. So eventually, the child can be comforted in the presence of the mother, and that's the formation of attachment. So that's using operant conditioning to explain how the infant may form attachment. But remember, attachment is a two-way emotional bond. So we need to be able to use operant conditioning to explain how the mother will form the attachment. Now, this one is slightly different to that of how the infant. And we're using, again, still reinforcement. Remember, the infant got positive reinforcement because of the reward. We're going to use here now, for the mother, negative reinforcement. Now, remember, negative reinforcement in general is carrying out a desired behavior to prevent a negative consequence. So that's what it is. So for example, you're not doing your homework, right, for the last 2 weeks. So then I turn around and I'll say, Giles, if you don't hand your homework in this week, I am going to phone your mum. Well, you don't want a phone call home. So what are you going to do? You're going to carry out the desired behavior and do the homework and hand it in. So negative reinforcement is to get the desired behavior to prevent a negative consequence. So we can apply this to the mother. The mother sees crying as undesirable behavior. Come on, I'm sure we've all heard a baby crying, going on and on. It's like, driving me mad, right? So the mother sees the crying as an undesirable behavior. So she's going to carry out behaviors to prevent that from happening or to minimize that from happening. So if the mother carries out the desirable behavior of feeding the infant, it will prevent the undesirable behavior of crying, or it will minimize it. Because mothers will say, oh, you know, Giles is due for a feed now. Let me get it ready. So they're ready to feed the child, then that will prevent the undesirable behavior of crying from happening. So the mother learns to be very responsive to the infant, and this encourages the formation of attachment from the mother's perspective. So she's becoming very sensitive to the infant's needs to prevent any undesirable behavior from happening, for example, crying. So here we've used operant conditioning to explain how attachment starts. Right, this is the start of attachment from an infant's perspective, and also that from the mother's or the caregiver's perspective. So this means we're now going to move on to classical conditioning. Remember, we're just looking at AO1s here, classical conditioning. Now, let's do a little bit of a recap here. The process of classical conditioning. Now, please note, we're not talking about the theory in general. When we do attachment, we're not talking about Pavlov's dogs. I'm just doing a quick recap on those, but then we're going to use that knowledge to explain the formation of attachment. So really important. I see plenty of times in exams where students think it's classical conditioning, that they have to explain the theory, then Pavlov's dogs, and then try and explain how it accounts for attachment. No, you're using this knowledge and applying it to attachment. But let's have a little bit of a recap. Now, a little bit of recap. Step one, we know a dog will naturally drool when it sees food. So the food is the unconditioned stimulus. The dog drools, that's the unconditioned response. It's innate. They didn't have to learn this. That's why it's called unconditioned. Remember, conditioning means the process of learning. Unconditioning, it doesn't need to be learned. It naturally happens. So if we wanted to teach the dog to drool to a bell, which is a neutral stimulus because they haven't learned how to respond to the bell, we will then have to make an association. Association means we need to pair the bell up, the neutral stimulus, with an unconditioned stimulus to get the desired response, which would be the unconditioned response of drooling. So we would pair the bell with the food and the dog will drool. And we will do this pairing, this association, quite a lot, till eventually, when we try it out, if the bell's rang on its own and the dog drools, then we know the bell has become a conditioned stimulus and the response is a conditioned response. So that was based on Pavlov's research. It's the basic ideas of classical conditioning. Now we need to apply this to attachment. Now, these are the concepts that we're going to use when we're applying it to attachment. You've got to think to yourself, how can we use these terms or these concepts to explain attachment? So you've got to work out, what is the unconditioned stimulus? What is the unconditioned response? What is the neutral stimulus? If these pairs are paired together, so what are we pairing together? And then what becomes the conditioned stimulus and which causes a conditioned response of what? So we're going to be using these key principles to explain. So let's apply them. So before classical conditioning is used, there we go. We've got a lovely crying baby. Food Sounds more like a little monkey there if you can hear that noise. So food is the unconditioned stimulus, which generates an unconditioned response of pleasure, right? It gives the baby a feeling of pleasure because it's taking away the hunger. The child didn't need to be taught that. The child didn't had to be taught how to eat or, what food does. So now we need to understand what our neutral stimulus is. So there we go. We have our baby crying. Now we introduce the baby to the mother. The mother is a neutral stimulus. The infant will carry on crying because it hasn't learned how to respond to the mother. So the mother is seen as a neutral stimulus. Now we need to start this process of conditioning. So what happens? Step 1. We have the baby that's crying. The food comes along. The baby feels pleasure and it becomes happy. So food, again, unconditioned stimulus. And once the baby is eating, it feels the pleasure. So that pleasure is the unconditioned response. Now, we need to pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus to get the unconditioned response. So in this case, the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus and the baby feels pleasure. So the mother brings the food. So we're making that this association happens, the baby feels happy. The mother and the food come at the same time, the baby then feels pleasure. The mother and the food come at the same time, the baby feels pleasure. The mother, you get my drift. So then over a bit of time, what happens? The mother comes to respond to the child's crying without the food, and the baby finds pleasure. So that means then the mother has become a conditioned stimulus, which gives the conditioned response of pleasure. And this is the formation of attachment. This is where attachment is starting to form. So by using the principles of classical conditioning, we can explain how an infant has to learn to form its attachment. So let's put that into words. You've got it. A little task for you to do. So the missing words are down at the bottom. Read through, gives you a nice little summary of what we've been doing. So I'd like you to pause the video now. Remember to unpause it when you've finished. Fantastic, thanks for pausing. So let's do a little bit of a check. Again, according to learning theory, which classical conditioning is part of learning theory, and learning theories is a behaviorist approach, the baby has to learn to form an attachment with his mother. By the process of classical conditioning, the baby forms an association between the mother, which is a neutral stimulus, and the feeling of pleasure that comes from being fed, which is an innate unconditioned response. So remember, the food is the unconditioned stimulus. At first, the baby simply feels comforted by the food. However, each time the baby is fed, the mother is there too. He quickly associates the mother with the pleasure of being fed. So he's making that association. Before long, the mother stimulates a feeling of pleasure on her own, even without the food. This means the baby feels happier when the mother is near, and it is the beginning of attachment. So the mother has gone from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, and she generates a conditioned response of pleasure and happiness, and therefore that's the start of attachment. You have got it there. Well, thank you, my lovelies. That was a AO1 account of the behaviorist or learning theory's explanation of attachment. Remember, there's always AO3s that go with everything. Till later, take care everybody and stay safe.